Let's start with a wrong turn. June 28, 1914. A royal motorcade is trying to navigate the rough cobblestone streets of Sarajevo, but the driver makes a mistake, hits the brakes, and the car stalls. It is a completely chaotic, accidental moment, but it happens to put the car right in front of a young nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. He steps out of the crowd, raises a pistol, and fires at point-blank range. Within the hour, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie are dead. At the time, this looked like a localized tragedy in a volatile regional territory. So how does a single assassination in an obscure city trigger the total collapse of global peace in just over a month? The assassination in Sarajevo acted as the mechanical trigger for a systemic collapse that had become almost mathematically inevitable. To understand why, we have to zoom out. By the early 1900s, Europe gave off a powerful illusion of stability. Trade flowed freely across borders, and the continent was wealthier and more physically connected than ever before. That deep connection extended to the very top of the political ladder. The royal families governing the most powerful nations on earth were actually related by blood and marriage. Germany was ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II. Russia was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, and Britain by King George V. They were all cousins. Because of this tight-knit leadership and massive economic integration, ordinary citizens viewed a large-scale, continent-wide war as an absolute impossibility. But underneath that civilized surface, there was no actual security. Decades of invisible pressure had been silently filling the continent, turning it into a massive powder keg. That powder keg was packed with 3 highly combustible ingredients that had been aggressively building up for years. Looking at this map, you see the first ingredient: nationalism. As the Ottoman Empire crumbled, Serbia aggressively expanded, dreaming of uniting Slavic peoples. This expansion pushed against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where millions of Slavs wanted to break away, threatening the empire. The second ingredient was a massive arms race. Germany, flexing its industrial muscle, spent years building a vast new navy specifically to challenge Britain's long-standing control of the oceans. Britain retaliated by constructing a new class of massively powerful battleships, the dreadnoughts. Pouring immense resources into these weapons just made both sides hyper-anxious. We can see the third and most dangerous ingredient in this schematic: a complex web of military alliances. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy tied themselves together as the Triple Alliance, while France, Russia, and Britain formed the rival Triple Entente. These treaties were supposed to deter aggression by balancing power. Instead, they created a mechanical trap. Any minor conflict between two nations would now forcibly drag nearly everyone else into combat, which brings us back to that stalled car in Sarajevo. Blaming Serbia for the Archduke's death, Austria-Hungary issued a deliberately impossible ultimatum designed to strip away Serbian sovereignty. Serbia agreed to most demands, but not all. That tiny gap in compliance was all Austria-Hungary needed to formally declare war exactly 1 month later. This flowchart violently snaps into action. A spark between Serbia and Austria-Hungary triggers Russia to mobilize. Strict treaty rules force Germany to declare war on Russia. France is pulled in. Germany's march through Belgium trips the final wire, dragging in Britain. In roughly 1 week, the mathematical logic of the treaties overpowered the people who signed them. Strict military mobilization timetables took over, and leaders were entirely incapable of stopping the machine they had built. By early August 1914, the illusion of a peaceful, modern Europe had completely shattered in a matter of days. The first major fighting broke out along the borders of Belgium and France. German forces pushed their invasion plan forward, while French forces launched massive counteroffensives into disputed territory. Yet the reaction back home was surreal. In capital cities across the continent, dense crowds poured into the streets to celebrate the news of war with genuine enthusiasm. Young men eagerly lined up to enlist and get measured for uniforms, convinced that they would secure a glorious victory and be home by Christmas. They had absolutely no comprehension of what was actually coming. The heavy artillery and machine guns built during the arms race were about to collide with the millions of men drafted by the alliance system. When you combine blind nationalism, massive arms races, and rigid diplomatic tripwires, you don't build peace. You build a machine where deterrence fails, human leaders lose control, and a single mistake makes global catastrophe inescapable. It is August 22, 1914. A massive formation of French infantry is marching across an open field, advancing directly toward enemy lines, when they are suddenly shredded by an invisible wall of artillery and machine gun fire. Look closely at the soldiers marching into this storm of lead. They are advancing in tight, shoulder-to-shoulder formations, wearing bright blue coats and vibrant red trousers, a style of dress essentially unchanged for decades, designed to boost morale, not to keep a soldier alive. By the time the sun sets on this single day of fighting, roughly 27,000 French soldiers lie dead. It remains the highest single-day death toll in the entire history of the French military. Why would one of Europe's most advanced militaries march into a modern crossfire dressed for a parade? And how did their commanders fail to anticipate the slaughter? Those 27,000 deaths were the immediate result of a brutal mathematical equation. 19th century military doctrine had collided directly with 20th century industrial firepower. To understand how they got there, we have to look back to earlier that summer. The trigger was pulled in the restive city of Sarajevo. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand activated a massive, complex web of European alliances. Within weeks, a localized crisis spiraled outward. By early August, Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Russia, and Britain had all mobilized their armies and declared war. Despite the massive scale of these armies, nearly every power involved shared the exact same assumption. They believed the conflict would be a swift, glorious campaign, wrapped up in a matter of weeks. That confidence was a total illusion. It was built entirely on theoretical war plans drawn up years in advance, by generals who severely underestimated what modern weaponry could actually do. Germany's Schlieffen Plan relied on sweeping through neutral Belgium to bypass French defenses. It was a race to defeat France before the Russian army mobilized. France, meanwhile, operated under Plan 17, prioritizing overwhelming direct frontal offensives into Alsace and Lorraine. When those attacking French columns reached the border, they ran headlong into entrenched German defenders. This photograph shows the kind of modern, rapid-firing machine gun waiting for them, a weapon capable of firing hundreds of rounds every single minute. The French belief that pure offensive spirit could carry the day shattered upon contact. Human willpower could not outpace defensive industrial weaponry. While the French offensives collapsed in the south, a different disaster was unfolding to the north. The massive German army was executing its sweep through neutral Belgium. Despite unexpectedly stubborn resistance from Belgian forces, the invading columns pushed through, leaving a trail of rubble in strategic towns like Hervé and Liège. Fulfilling their treaty obligations, the British Expeditionary Force landed on the continent and soon collided with these overwhelming German numbers near the town of Mons. The British soldiers were vastly outnumbered, but they brought a unique tactical advantage to the field. Their infantry fired their rifles with such speed and precision that advancing German troops reportedly believed they were facing massed machine gun placements. Yet, even that exceptional marksmanship wasn't enough to hold the line. The sheer volume of incoming German soldiers eventually overwhelmed the defenders, forcing the British into a desperate, fighting withdrawal. Across the entire frontier, the result was the same. Whether it was aggressive French charges in the south or disciplined British defense in the north, individual heroism stood no chance against the raw scale and firepower of modern war. By the end of August, the coordinated Allied offensives had completely disintegrated. The front lines dissolved into a chaotic, full-scale retreat. The grand traditions of European warfare, the glorious cavalry charges, the colorful uniforms, the rigid infantry formations, had proven completely useless. Those old tactics effectively died on the frontier. Meanwhile, the German army pressed its advantage. Moving at a relentless pace, their sprawling infantry columns pushed deeper into French territory far faster than Allied commanders thought possible. The opening weeks of combat shattered any remaining illusions. The fighting would not be wrapped up by Christmas. Instead, it had devolved into a desperate race for national survival. As September 1914 begins, the strategic reality for the Allies is terrifying. The retreating armies have been pushed back for weeks until the advancing German forces are a mere 30 kilometers away. This photograph shows monuments in the heart of Paris, heavily sandbagged against impending artillery fire. The capital is bracing for a total siege or a complete collapse. The disastrous decisions made on the frontiers have pushed France to the very brink of defeat. The survival of the nation now comes down to one final, desperate defense in the Miracle on the Marne. By early September 1914, the German army was moving with terrifying speed. After crushing Allied forces at the borders, they swept through Belgium and into northern France. By the first few days of the month, German troops were within a shocking 30 kilometers of Paris. The situation was so dire that the French government had already evacuated the capital. They relocated to the city of Bordeaux, fully expecting Paris to fall at any moment. But then, the commander of the German First Army, General Alexander von Kluck, made a choice. Instead of continuing his march around the capital, he abruptly ordered his men to turn southeast, pivoting away from Paris. Why would the architect of a highly successful invasion abandon his master plan just miles from the finish line? That single, localized decision would halt the German advance and dictate the terms of a grueling 4-year global conflict. This map illustrates the core geometry of Germany's original strategy, the Schlieffen Plan. The design required a massive sweep, with German forces wrapping wide around the western edge of Paris before curling back to crush the French army from behind. The entire plan relied on a strict time limit. Germany needed to knock France out of the fight immediately, securing the Western Front before the massive Russian army could fully mobilize on their eastern border. Up until the first days of September, the strategy was working almost perfectly. The Allied forces were locked in a constant, frantic retreat as the German advance pressed deeper into France. But von Kluck grew concerned about losing contact with the retreating French troops directly ahead of him. He wanted to maintain constant direct pressure, so he cut the corner, turning his forces southeast instead of executing the wide, time-consuming sweep around the city. In doing so, he traded the safety of the master plan for immediate tactical pressure, creating a massive risk that left Germany highly vulnerable to a two-front war. By pivoting southeast, von Kluck opened up an unprotected edge, an exposed right flank, putting his army directly within striking distance of Paris. French Commander General Joseph Joffre immediately spotted the mistake. He began quietly repositioning his exhausted troops, assembling a new army specifically to strike that open flank. At the same time, he convinced the retreating British forces to stop falling back and prepare a coordinated counteroffensive. To make the counterattack work, the French needed to get thousands of reserve troops out to the front lines faster than the rail lines allowed. The military governor of Paris, General Joseph Gallieni, came up with a highly unconventional solution. He requisitioned the city's fleet of commercial taxicabs. Hundreds of ordinary civilian cars were packed with soldiers and driven straight into the battle zone. This rapid infusion of reinforcements allowed the Allies to spring their trap, catching the German command completely off guard on September 5th, before von Kluck could correct his position. What followed was days of chaotic, brutal combat across the Marne River Valley, with well over 1 million soldiers fighting along a massive front. Under intense pressure, von Kluck was forced to defend his exposed side, aggressively diverting troops away from the center. This shift created a new problem. A wide, undefended gap tore open directly between his First Army and the Second Army. The combined British and French forces pushed directly into that empty space. By occupying that void, the Allies were perfectly positioned to split the German offensive right down the middle, creating a very real threat of total encirclement. Facing a catastrophic collapse, German commanders made an agonizing call on September 9th. They ordered a general retreat, pulling their forces back to the Aisne River. The immediate crisis was over, and Paris was safe. The forward momentum that had defined the opening leaks of the war was stopped cold. This diagram shows the aftermath. After falling back, both armies tried repeatedly to outmaneuver one another. They pushed further and further north, each side desperately searching for another exposed flank to exploit, in a series of maneuvers known as the Race to the Sea. Neither side succeeded. They just kept extending their defensive positions northward until they quite literally ran out of land, stopping only when they reached the English Channel. By late 1914, millions of soldiers began digging in. That continuous line from Switzerland to the sea solidified into hundreds of miles of defensive trenches. The fast-paced, mobile warfare that characterized the invasion was gone, replaced by a grueling, static stalemate. Because they failed to capture Paris and knock France out of the fight quickly, the German army found itself permanently trapped in the exact scenario their planners feared most, fighting a massive war on two fronts simultaneously. In a matter of days, the belief that the conflict would be over by Christmas vanished. A single tactical decision on the outskirts of Paris had halted an invasion and guaranteed 4 years of grinding violence. Imagine standing in the choking fog of an East Prussian marsh in August 1914. You are a commanding general, your supply lines are severed, and in every direction you look, you realize you are entirely surrounded. In the span of a few days, an entire army, tens of thousands of men, simply disappeared into these forests. They were trapped and destroyed almost to the last man. Looking at this photograph, you can see the scale of the force. This is an endless column of Russian infantrymen, and it is just a fraction of the massive military machine that had marched into this region weeks earlier. The battle that took place here, Tannenberg, turned a guaranteed Russian victory into one of the most complete military traps in history. To understand how they got trapped, we have to look at Germany's overarching war strategy, the Schlieffen Plan. This was a strict ticking clock operation designed to defeat France in the west before Russia's enormous military could fully mobilize in the east. But Russia defied those expectations. They mobilized their forces at breakneck speed, launching an early invasion of East Prussia to force Germany to pull its troops away from the French border. As this map shows, the situation for the German defenders was desperate. Two massive arrows, representing two full Russian armies, are rapidly encroaching on a very thin defensive line, representing a single, drastically outnumbered German army. This rapid offensive had the potential to crush the German homeland, but it was undermined by a series of systemic internal failures. The Russian invasion force was split into two distinct wings. General Alexander Samsonov commanded the army pushing up from the south, and General Paul von Rennenkamp led the army advancing from the east towards the north. The first major crack in their operation was psychological. Here is General Rennenkamp. He and Samsonov carried a bitter, lingering personal feud from years prior, and they reportedly despised one another. That personal divide was made worse by a geographical one. Look at the terrain between them. This chain of the Masurian lakes and dense, sprawling forests physically drove a wedge straight down the middle of the two advancing Russian routes. When you combine slow communication with two generals whose mutual hatred makes them unwilling to coordinate, you guarantee they won't rescue each other when things go wrong. Then came the technological failure. The Russian command structure was transmitting its exact operational plans and troop coordinates over unencrypted open radio channels. A German staff officer named Max Hoffmann recognized exactly what was happening. He sat in his headquarters reading the Russian playbook in real time. This map highlights Hoffmann's response. He gambled on the Russian dysfunction, leaving only a minimal defensive force in the north to distract Rennenkampf. He bet that the bitter rivalry would keep the northern general from investigating a ghost army. Meanwhile, as you can see in this photo of German soldiers crowding into train cars, the German command utilized their advanced domestic railway network. They loaded the massive bulk of their fighting force onto trains, shifting them south to ambush Samsonov. Samsonov pushed his men onward, believing he was chasing a broken, retreating enemy. In reality, the German intelligence advantage allowed them to secretly build a cage around his entire army. Acting on that faulty intelligence, Samsonov ordered his forces deeper into the German forests, stretching his own supply lines to the breaking point. Then the trap sprang. This tactical map shows the massed German forces suddenly sweeping down in a dual pincer movement, coming around both exposed flanks and completely engulfing the southern Russian position near the village of Tannenberg. Expecting open terrain and a fleeing enemy, The advancing Russian forces instead slammed headfirst into entrenched German defensive lines, like these soldiers aiming rifles from a defensive trench. The momentum of the Russian advance broke instantly. Within a matter of hours, a forward march turned into a struggle for survival, with every possible route of retreat sealed behind them. Trapped in the dense marshland, the Russian army disintegrated. Units lost contact with commanders, ammunition ran dry, and soldiers began starving in the woods. The human toll was staggering. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were killed or wounded, and as this massive aerial view shows, this crowd of roughly 92,000 Russian prisoners was forced to surrender. Overwhelmed by the annihilation of his forces, General Samsonov walked alone into the woods and took his own life rather than face the Tsar. His body was never recovered. The victory turned these regional commanders into national heroes. Here are Hindenburg and Ludendorff. This partnership cemented their authority, dominating Germany's military direction for the rest of the war and shaping German politics for decades. For the Russian Empire, losing an entire army in the opening weeks of the conflict established a baseline of failure for the Eastern Front. Tannenberg was a grim omen for Russia's next 4 years, a pattern of throwing vast, brave armies into a meat grinder, doomed by poor leadership and systemic failures at a staggering human cost. In late October 1914, a scratch force of a few hundred British soldiers gathered near the village of Gallipoli. Surrounded by smoke and mud, the small group launched a counterattack that looked entirely suicidal. They pushed back a much larger German force, holding a line that was minutes away from a total collapse. Had this moment gone differently, the road to the English Channel ports would have been open. This desperate defense required the most advanced military powers on Earth to throw scrambled remnants and barely trained university students into a Belgian town to prevent a strategic catastrophe. This clash represents the moment the war of movement reached its limit. After this battle, soldiers stopped standing on the earth and started living inside it. In September, the French and British had halted the German advance just short of Paris at the Battle of the Marne. Germany's plan for a quick victory failed, and the belief that the war would be short began to fade. Each army then spent weeks attempting to get around the other's northern flank. Historians call this the race to the sea, a series of failed maneuvers that stretched the front line further and further toward the Belgian coast. Eventually, both sides literally ran out of land. The lines reached the coast, leaving only a small gap around a quiet town called Ypres. Ypres stood as a geographic bottleneck, the final place where the momentum of the world's fastest armies ran out of room. Breaking through at Ypres offered Germany a chance to join the Channel ports, a move that would have severed Britain's supply lines to its army in France. For the Allies, holding this town was the only way to protect their lifeline. Because neither side could afford to lose, both committed everything they had left to the fight. Britain relied on its corps of highly trained professional soldiers. These men were capable of such rapid and accurate rifle fire that German troops often believed they were facing machine guns. Facing them were massive waves of German volunteer regiments. These units were filled with young university students, many of whom were eager to prove themselves despite having almost no training. This meeting of elite defenders and massed, inexperienced attackers turned the fighting into a grinding, chaotic series of clashes spread across a handful of ridgelines and villages. In places like Langemark, the German waves were cut down in such numbers that the battle earned a grim nickname back home, the Massacre of the Innocents, a reference to the young volunteers who made up the casualties. British losses were equally devastating. By late November, the original professional force that had crossed the Channel in August was largely destroyed, forcing Britain to rebuild its military from scratch. Both armies were exhausted. Neither side had the strength left to keep attacking, and the staggering losses meant that any further movement across the open ground was impossible. The math of modern warfare had taken over. Machine guns and artillery made open movement across the battlefield suicide. The army stopped moving because the environment had become too lethal to survive above ground. Unable to advance and slaughtered in the open, the soldiers did the only thing they could. They started digging. These positions began as simple, shallow scrapes in the ground intended for temporary cover. But as the fighting continued, these scrapes became deep trenches. They were reinforced with timber and sandbags and connected by winding communication lines that ran far back from the front. Digging in transformed from a battlefield tactic into a permanent way of life. By mid-November, a continuous line of trenches stretched for 700 kilometers, running from the Belgian coast all the way to the Swiss border. This line was protected by massive networks of barbed wire, creating the narrow, lethal strip of no man's land that would define the front. The expectation of a war of rapid movement, one that would be over by Christmas, vanished. In its place came a static war of attrition, where gaining a few hundred meters cost thousands of lives. The First Battle of Ypres defined the brutal, static nature of every clash that would follow for the next 4 years. It is December 1915, on a narrow peninsula in the Mediterranean, in the dead of night. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers are quietly tying rags around their heavy leather boots, muffling their footsteps as they prepare to abandon their trenches and sneak away into the dark. To make sure the enemy trenches, sitting just a few meters away, don't realize they're leaving, the retreating men have set up a brilliant deception. They've rigged their rifles with empty tin cans and string, allowing dripping water to slowly fill the cans until the weight pulls the triggers. The sporadic gunfire echoes through the night, convincing the enemy the lines are still fully manned. But why is a massive army going to such incredible lengths to fake its presence, just so it can run away? And how did a plan originally designed by some of the top military minds in Europe end up requiring a desperate midnight escape? This is Gallipoli. It is a military campaign that lasted 8 months, cost hundreds of thousands of casualties, and failed to achieve a single one of its strategic goals. Yet out of that complete disaster, it became the proudest founding moment for 2 modern nations on the other side of the planet. To understand how they got there, we have to rewind to late 1914. On the Western Front, the First World War has already ground into a bloody, immobile deadlock. Hundreds of miles of trenches stretch across Europe, with neither side able to break through the mud and machine gun fire. Frustrated by this total paralysis, a young, ambitious First Lord of the Admiralty named Winston Churchill starts looking for a back door to strike the enemy. The target he settles on is the Ottoman Empire, which had recently allied with Germany. Looking at the map of the region, the plan is beautifully simple. The Allies would force a fleet of heavily armed warships through the Dardanelles Strait, a narrow 38-mile waterway, to directly threaten the Ottoman capital of Constantinople. If the naval fleet could park its guns right outside the capital, the Allies could knock the Ottoman Empire entirely out of the war. That would instantly open a massive year-round supply line through the Black Sea to arm Russia. On paper, it was a brilliant geographic solution to an ugly tactical problem. Rather than sending millions to die over a few yards of mud in France, ships could bypass the stalemate entirely and shorten the war. In February 1915, the Allied battleships arrive and attempt to push their way into the strait, but the Ottoman defenses are ready. High up on the cliffs, hidden coastal artillery batteries rain fire down on the ships, while below the surface, thick, hidden minefields tear through the armored hulls. Several massive Allied battleships are sunk or severely damaged. The British Navy pulls back. The strictly naval assault is abandoned. But the Allied commanders refuse to let go of their grand strategy. Instead of accepting defeat, they pivot. They decide to order a massive land invasion, putting ground troops directly onto the Gallipoli Peninsula to manually hike up the hills, silence the Ottoman guns, and clear the strait for the ships. By refusing to accept a naval loss, leadership commits hundreds of thousands of infantrymen to a rugged, unfamiliar terrain, turning a geographic shortcut into an incredibly dangerous trap. On April 25, 1915, the invasion begins. A massive combined force of Australian and New Zealand troops are sent in rowboats toward the shore. They have to jump into the Mediterranean and manually drag their heavy artillery out of the surf. But almost immediately, the plan falls apart. Strong currents and navigational errors mean the Anzac forces miss their target beach entirely. Instead of flat, manageable terrain, they wash up on what would become known as Anzac Cove. They are staring straight up at sheer, rugged cliffs covered in thick, thorny scrub. Moving inland is nearly impossible. Waiting for them at the top of those cliffs is a determined Ottoman officer named Mustafa Kemal, who would later become known as Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey. He immediately orders a fierce and relentless counterattack, pinning the Anzacs to a tiny, exposed strip of sand. The grand strategy, explicitly designed to bypass the trenches of the Western Front, has instantly created a miniature, vertical version of it. The troops dig in, and the campaign devolves into a nightmare. Soldiers endure scorching summer heat that rots their rations, freezing winter blizzards, rampant, deadly dysentery, and severe shortages of clean water. The combat is brutal and intimate. Allied and Ottoman trenches are dug into the rocky soil, sometimes just a few meters apart. Men resort to using periscopes just to look over the dirt mounds without taking a sniper bullet to the head. This misery lasts for 8 months. By the time it is over, both sides have suffered a combined 500,000 casualties. The Allies gain absolutely no meaningful territory. In December, the commanders finally admit defeat. And in a bitter twist of irony, that flawless, completely silent midnight retreat we saw at the beginning turns out to be the only genuinely well-executed part of the entire devastating campaign. Strategically, the operation achieved nothing. Constantinople was never threatened. The Ottoman Empire kept firm control of the strait. The war in Europe dragged on for 3 more agonizing years. In Britain, the political fallout was immediate. Winston Churchill bore the brunt of the public blame, was demoted, and resigned from the government, spending years trying to rebuild his reputation. Viewed solely as a military operation from London, Gallipoli was a catastrophic failure of planning and hubris that left the European map completely unchanged. But in the Southern Hemisphere, the legacy of Gallipoli took on a completely different meaning. In 1915, Australia and New Zealand were incredibly young nations. Though they had their own governments, they were still deeply tied to the British Empire. When their men landed at Anzac Cove, it marked the very first time their soldiers had fought together on a global stage, as distinct, recognized national forces. They were ordered into an impossible situation by commanders thousands of miles away. But the shared suffering, the endurance, and the mutual reliance those soldiers displayed on those cliffs forged a unique, unified identity. They went in as subjects of an empire, and they fought as Australians and New Zealanders. Today, the anniversary of those initial landings, April 25th, is known as Anzac Day. It is the most solemn day on their national calendars. They do not observe it to celebrate a victory, but as a solemn day of remembrance for the sacrifice that defined them. The physical site in modern Turkey now stands as a quiet memorial to this history, honoring the dead from both sides of the trenches. It leaves us with a profound realization. Sometimes the foundation of a nation's identity isn't built on the triumphant wars they won, but on the resilience they forged in the devastating wars they lost. Mid-afternoon, April 22, 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres. Soldiers looking out over no man's land spot a thick, yellowish-green cloud rolling steadily over the muddy terrain toward their trench. Nobody runs. Nobody takes cover. Having never been warned that a weapon like this even exists, the soldiers simply watch the fog approach with pure curiosity. What exactly was inside that cloud? How did it manage to clear trenches when millions of artillery shells could not? And why did this single afternoon change the trajectory of modern combat? That spring afternoon, warfare moved beyond a purely physical struggle and became a toxic environmental one. By the spring of 1915, the Western Front had settled into a miserable, waterlogged stalemate defined by hundreds of miles of parallel trenches. Month after month, both sides launched repeated offensives. They took staggering casualties without achieving a single meaningful territorial breakthrough. German commanders were desperate to break this deadlock. That desperation drove them to secretly develop a new weapon, one that explicitly violated existing international agreements on the conduct of war. The weapon was chlorine gas, and its development was overseen by a German scientist named Fritz Haber. Haber offered the military a way to fight without a single bullet being fired. Released in large enough quantities, this gas could inflict massive casualties and clear enemy positions on its own. The mechanics of the attack were simple. German forces buried thousands of pressurized cylinders along their front line, waited for a favorable wind, and opened the valves, releasing over 150 tons of chlorine directly toward the Allied positions. This animation shows how chlorine attacks the body. Inhaled, it targets the respiratory system, rapidly degrading lung tissue and causing intense burning. For heavily exposed soldiers, the damaged tissues react by producing fluid, causing victims to essentially drown inside their own lungs. The immediate tactical result was total chaos. Coughing, gasping soldiers fled in a panic or collapsed outright, creating a massive, undefended gap in the Allied line. Troops could hide in bunkers to survive artillery shells, but they could not hide from the very air they needed to breathe. But the deployment of this gas revealed a deep tactical irony. German commanders had vastly underestimated how effective their own weapon would be. Because they didn't expect such a complete collapse of the Allied defense, they hadn't massed enough reserve infantry nearby to actually push through the giant opening they had just created. This delay gave Canadian and other Allied units time to scramble forward and violently plug the sudden hole in the defensive line before the Germans could reorganize and advance. These stabilizing troops quickly discovered desperate, improvised countermeasures. They found that holding wet cloths, soaked in water or even urine, over their faces could temporarily neutralize the chlorine as they fought. A lack of strategic foresight turned what was intended to be a decisive breakthrough into just another chaotic scramble to maintain the trenches. By the time the fighting around Ypres finally wound down in late May, the front lines had barely shifted. The human cost of the engagement, however, was staggering. Combined casualties across both sides reached roughly 70,000 men. Yet despite that massive death toll and the use of a terrifying new technology, neither side achieved a decisive breakthrough. The Second Battle of Ypres ultimately reinforced the exact same frustrating, grinding pattern of trench warfare that the gas had been designed to solve. The legacy of Ypres lies in the chemical warfare Pandora's box it opened, provoking immediate and worldwide outrage. Outrage quickly morphed into imitation. Both sides rapidly developed deadlier chemical agents, starting with chlorine, escalating to phosgene, and eventually mustard gas. With this invisible threat, gas masks became standard, mandatory survival equipment. The trauma inflicted by these agents was so profound that after the war, chemical weapons became one of the few forms of armament formally banned by modern international treaties. Today, Ypres stands as a grim milestone, the moment soldiers first looked up and saw death itself drifting toward them on the wind. On February 21, 1916, 1 million artillery shells rained down on northeastern France in just a few hours. Behind that wall of explosions, German infantry marched forward. They quickly swallowed up several major French defensive positions, including the heavily fortified Fort Douaumont, encountering almost no resistance. Curious, slightly slower, but the German high command had no real interest in keeping the ground they were taking. Why launch the largest artillery barrage of the war to capture a target you don't actually want? And how did that specific logic create the longest single battle of the First World War? This opening assault was a calculated psychological trap. The German military designed it specifically to manipulate the French army into destroying itself. By early 1916, the Western Front was paralyzed. Nearly 2 years of traditional military tactics, trying to break through enemy lines to capture territory, had produced nothing but an endless, unmoving line of trenches. German General Erich von Falkenhayn realized the current strategy was failing. He concluded that to win, Germany had to stop focusing on capturing land and start focusing on systematically destroying soldiers. To do that, he needed the perfect bait. He chose the fortress city of Verdun. Steeped in military history, it was a location French leadership simply would not allow themselves to surrender. This is a map of the French defensive pocket at Verdun. Falkenhayn's doctrine of attrition relied on threatening to capture this city, forcing France to continually funnel troops into a small, concentrated area. Once trapped, superior German artillery could fire continuously from 3 sides, converging inward to grind the French army down. He planned to weaponize French national pride against them, turning their absolute refusal to retreat into a fatal weakness. The initial assault threw French command into a panic. General Philippe Pétain was quickly brought in to halt the German advance. He made a rapid, definitive calculation. Verdun would be held, whatever the cost. His directive gave rise to a rallying cry that defined the defense. They shall not pass. But keeping a massive army alive required supplies, and the intense German shellfire had already erased nearly all the local roads and rail lines. Pétain's solution was the Voie Sacrée, or Sacred Road. He organized a single, highly orchestrated supply route kept open 24 hours a day. A relentless conveyor belt of trucks rotated fresh troops and ammunition directly into the danger zone, while carrying the wounded out. By building this highly effective engine of survival, the French accomplished exactly what Falkenhayn had hoped. They locked themselves perfectly into his artillery trap. For the next 10 months, the environment itself was effectively vaporized. Entire villages and dense forests were churned into a massive, cratered sea of mud. Soldiers lived and died within these splintered landscapes and shattered concrete forts, pinned down by a near-constant barrage of heavy explosive shells. This timeline tracks the front line over the central forts. Control over key positions like Fort Douaumont shifted back and forth repeatedly over the course of several months. The gains were microscopic, measured in mere hundreds of meters. Taking and retaking those ruined concrete positions demanded immense, agonizing sacrifices from the exhausted French defenders. Traditional warfare had ceased. The battle had devolved completely into a static test of sheer human endurance against industrial machinery. By December 1916, the momentum broke. German forces were exhausted, and French counterattacks pushed them backward out of the territory they initially captured. Overlaying the February front line with December's final position, the map is functionally identical. After 10 months of combat, the boundaries barely moved. This chart shows the true cost, nearly 800,000 casualties, split evenly between French and German forces. Falkenhayn succeeded in his goal of bleeding France white, but he failed to anticipate that his trap would bleed Germany at the exact same rate. The staggering losses ultimately cost him his position as commander. The brutal mathematics of his plan failed because it destroyed the attacking force just as efficiently as the defending one. For France, surviving the onslaught elevated General Pétain to a status of untouchable national heroism that would carry immense weight for decades. The physical landscape of Verdun remains permanently scarred. The ground is unnaturally shaped, formed entirely by the violence of millions of artillery shells. Zero meaningful territory was gained, yet hundreds of thousands of lives remain entombed in this small stretch of northeastern France. The battle is remembered today entirely for what it cost. It stands as history's grim, ultimate monument to a nation tested to its absolute limit and somehow refusing to break. The morning of July 1, 1916, British infantrymen climbed out of their trenches, formed into strict, orderly lines, and began walking across no man's land. They had been told to expect zero enemy resistance. Instead, they walked directly into a slaughter. In a matter of hours, 57,000 men fell. To this day, it remains the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army. Which raises an immediate question. For a full week leading up to that morning, British artillery fired 1.5 million shells at the German lines. How did a bombardment of that magnitude fail to protect these advancing troops? Why were these men ordered to walk at a slow, deliberate pace into enemy fire? and what happens when military commanders refuse to admit their strategy has failed. The events of that single morning exposed a fatal disconnect. The commanders had drawn up a theory of modern warfare on paper, but the grim, physical reality on the ground was entirely different. By the summer of 1916, the war had ground into an exhausting stalemate. Across the Western Front, the French army was bleeding out in the desperate defense of Verdun. British commanders, led by General Douglas Haig, urgently needed to relieve the pressure on their allies. Haig believed a major offensive along the Somme River could finally break through the German lines and end the war. His entire plan rested on the guns. Haig believed Billy's sustained, overwhelming artillery bombardment could do the heavy lifting of combat, virtually eliminating the need for infantry fighting. The scale was immense. For 7 straight days, British guns unleashed an almost continuous roar. The explosions were so loud, people reported hearing the rumble all the way across the English Channel in London. British commanders convinced themselves they had reduced warfare to a simple equation: fire enough heavy shells into a designated area, and the enemy defenses will cease to exist. On paper, the logic seemed sound. A 7-day bombardment was supposed to shatter the German trenches, vaporize their barbed wire, and break the defenders' will to fight. But there was a severe miscalculation. The German troops weren't sitting in shallow, exposed trenches waiting to be hit. They had dug in, deep underground. Many of the defenders were waiting out the shelling in heavily reinforced bunkers, some built more than 10 meters below the surface. They survived the barrage largely unharmed. Then there was the barbed wire. The British relied on explosive shrapnel shells, assuming the blasts would shred the defenses. Instead of cutting the wire, the explosions often just churned the ground and tangled the steel coils into thicker, impassable knots. And finally, dropping 1.5 million shells over a solid week eliminated any element of surprise. The barrage told the German commanders exactly where the assault was coming and roughly when. The largest bombardment in history did not clear a path for the infantry. It simply served as a massive 7-day warning siren, giving the enemy ample time to prepare. The moment the British guns finally stopped, surviving German soldiers climbed from their deep bunkers, stepped into the shattered trenches, and began manning their weapons. Because their training dictated they would face minimal resistance, the British troops simply advanced in slow, orderly lines. They were caught in the uncut wire out in the open and cut down by overlapping machine gun fire. Despite absorbing tens of thousands of casualties in just a few hours, British command refused to halt the offensive. They kept pushing, grinding the battle on for 5 more agonizing months. By September, during an assault near Flers Courcelette, a desperate technological pivot emerged. For the very first time in history, British forces deployed tanks in combat. These early machines were painfully slow. They were mechanically unreliable and frequently broke down before they even reached the enemy lines. Their immediate impact was limited, but they were a direct response to the horrific reality of the trenches. The slaughter on the Somme proved that exposed infantry could no longer survive against industrialized weapons. To break the deadlock, militaries would literally have to invent armored metal boxes to shield their men. By mid-November 1916, the offensive finally ground to a halt, not by a decisive military victory, but by the arrival of harsh winter weather that made further movement impossible. This chart tracks the final toll. Between Allied and German forces, roughly 1 million soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Translated into territory gained, the British and French pushed the front line forward by just 10 kilometers. The German army absorbed grievous losses that would weaken it for the rest of the war, but the sweeping, decisive breakthrough that General Haig had promised never materialized. The volume of explosives left the French landscape scarred beyond recognition, transforming quiet farmland into an alien terrain of cavernous craters and shattered tree stumps. Before 1916, many still held on to a 19th century romanticized view of honorable combat. The Somme violently stripped that away, replacing it with the cold reality of industrialized mass destruction. The battle stands as a haunting monument. It is tragic proof that executing the honorable tactics of the past is a death sentence, when faced with the mechanized weapons of the present.